who might say we need a new project?
Oh, fine. So suggest one. There's absolutely nothing wrong with people putting forward competing projects. I just think that's a very fundamental project. If you're going to build a nation, you can't build it on hungry people. You can't build it if they're not properly housed, and you certainly can't build it, if they don't feel part of it. And I think you will see in a lot of the current discourse. I mean, the last time I was in Guyana, I believe there was a sign, a big billboard by the Ministry of Agriculture about feeding the nation. Now, these are not unique to Guyana. Even America talks about feeding the nation, which is why it subsidizes its wheat farmers. These are universal concepts, Selwyn.
We spend a lot of time, you and I, in cyberspace, and it is filled with, especially in Guyana context, it's filled with talks about change and coalition. There seems to be a large movement towards a large unity movement. What do you think is attributed to this this change in political attitude amongst the Guyanese people?
Well, first, you're presuming that what you're saying is correct, which is that there's a large change or a large movement towards the coalition. I presume you mean the political coalition.
Yes.
I can't speak with any authority on that. What I do know, though, is that if you've had, incumbency, especially if it goes on for too long, naturally leads to the rise of the question, what's next? People get bored, people get very tired, people want change, not necessarily because there's something specific to go to, but because it's the nature of evolution and of change. As I said before, I think, and it's really hard to back the conversation I was having previous to joining you here, Selwyn. I think most people I speak to, in government, out of government, rabidly anti-government, rabidly pro-government, believe that this thing is on a knife edge. Okay, I haven't met anyone who says, "Yeah, we're gonna walk it." And I'm lucky enough to be able to speak to people across the spectrum. The important thing for me, which is missing, is I don't see the vision. I don't see the Project Guyana that you spoke about. I don't see the sense of inclusivity. Someone I have come to the conclusion that on May the 12th, half the country will be alienated. Whoever wins this thing.
What if that doesn't happen?
If what doesn't happen?
Half the country becomes alienated.
Oh, but well, it would be great. But I certainly don't see it.
What are you personally hoping for?
Hoping for? Very well. Let me be very candid with you. I'm hoping that we have an election result which most Guyanese can embrace, which most Guyanese can own and say, right, they believe this is correct.
Fair enough. Fair enough. How should Guyana address its widening economic and education gaps between the haves and the have-nots?
I could be trying to say with great urgency, I think we got to do practical things. And for me, the educational issue is more important because that's the foundation of society. The wealth thing, there are lots of ways you can address wealth disparities through tax regimes. That's easy to do. The challenge that you've identified, Selwyn, is education, and not just education in academic terms, but education in a broader sense of how do we impart messages to our people which are unifying. How do we create an environment where people can share in the experiences of each other? And I suppose I like to refer to it as socialization. I've set up something called a Rhymer Learning Trust, where we're trying to get kids onto mobile platforms. But there are lots of other things. Lance Hines is doing something also very creative. Yes, Brain Street is doing something very creative. I think as many people as possible need to pile into the education space and provide support to the state. I'm not talking the government, the state, to ensure that we can revive the educational regime in Guyana. And there's no end of things which can be done. But in practical sense, I think we have to embrace new technologies in order to ensure that kids who can't go to formal classrooms, kids, in rural areas, who simply probably have other priorities immediately can access education. I think also we have to use education, as I've said before, as a means of nation building in a very real and pointed sense. And there I must go back. Gosh, people are going to make assumptions about my political allegiance. We have to go back. I think some of the very active propagandist type education we had when I was growing up, which was very clear to say, you're Guyanese, you have an obligation to serve, and these are some of the areas in which you can.
When you were growing up, or we were growing up, the Caribbean was wealthy in young leaders. Most of the Caribbean countries just gained independence and so on. First of all, who are some of those leaders that you respected or you admire?
Errol Barrow, Eric Williams, Michael Manley, Forbes Burnham, Eugenia Charles, although ideologically, I thought she was up the creek. But as leaders, we had a wealth of leaders. And some of part of the reason we did was ironically because that cream of society who went to study largely in England met in England. They socialized together and they created bonds which when they went back to the Caribbean, the Eric Williamses, Barrows, etc., the Padmores, they were able to have a shared understanding of what the Caribbean project could be, what the post-colonial project could be. That generation was gone, and thanks to CNN, thanks to the fact that a lot of the leaders were educated, some in England, some in the US, some in the Soviet Union, etc., we no longer have that commonness of experience and that shared sense of a Caribbean project. I mean, it's in tatters. The guys who built CARICOM, those early leaders, their work has pretty much been nullified by the kind of divisiveness and the real small-mindedness of our leadership now.
I want to touch on Cuba a little bit. All right? Normalizing relationships with the United States. Embassy is projected to be open, U.S. Embassy in Cuba. What does this mean for the Caribbean in terms of cultural and economic development?
But actually, there's a risk, which I think we need to be careful of. When the U.S., had this isolationist and quite frankly illogical and quite silly exclusion of attempt to exclude Cuba. Cuba was quite assertive, well not assertive, but Cuba was embraced by most of the rest of the world. People talk about Cuba coming out of isolation. No, it's the US which has come out of isolation. Cuba's always been, part of the international community and embraced by the international community. However, the US is a major point of interaction for any country and absorbs lots of resources, and Cuba needs some of those in order to accelerate its development. The big danger for places like the Caribbean is that Cuba shifts its focus. Okay? In the same way that, for example, China, or the Soviet Union, which became Russia, had a détente and shifted its focus from, kind of third world focused engagement, to really embracing the EU and the United States, and therefore lessening its attention on what were previously client nations like ours. We have the same risk in Cuba on a smaller scale, and I suspect the Cubans will be slightly more loyal than the Russians were to their historical relationships. But the big danger is that with the United States in focus now, Cuba shifts its energies, which would be logical in many respects, to be quite honest. But we have to work to make that engagement relevant to Cuba. Cuba has given and given and given to us for many decades. What have we given to Cuba?
What do we have to give to Cuba?
Well, I think there are a couple of things we can. If you mean the Caribbean specifically?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a bit of a challenge, but there are certain resources, which, for example, Guyana has access to minerals, etc., which Cuba doesn't have. And I think we could have been a lot more creative and a lot more generous in terms of allowing Cuban expertise and Cuban parastatals, etc., to get involved in those. Perhaps the rest of the Caribbean, in terms of tourism, could develop joint programs of tourism. But it's going to be a challenge.
Well, let's take a quick break, Kojo. We're back with Kojo Parris. Kojo, if you could speak to the late President Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, Dr. Chetty Jagan, and Dr. Walter Rodney, what two questions would you ask each of them?
I think the first question I would ask them is, when can you come back? How soon can you come back? No, but I think I would want to understand some of the critical decisions. So, for example, both Jagan and Burnham in particular, I think have some unanswered questions about how they allowed the PPP of 1953, the 1953 project, to collapse as spectacularly as they did. And I would ask them, are they happy with the consequence of their actions from the breakup of that historic?
You would ask both of them the same questions.
Absolutely.
And what about Dr. Rodney?
Oh, I'm a great admirer of Rodney, but I would ask him if he would still act in what I think was an enormously naive manner he did in terms of the political stance he took. I think at a moment in Guyana's history when probably compromise is a lot more in the broad interest of the Guyanese nation.
I want to go back to this topic of change in Guyana. Do you believe, or can Guyana afford not to change?
I'm not sure. You got to define change. You mean have a change of government now?
Yes.
The thing about countries, Selwyn, is that we always assume that there's some event which, if it doesn't happen, the whole thing will fall apart.
Hold on, Kojo. Hold on. That was smooth. That was very smooth. Let's rewind a little bit. Not just a change of government, but change in the distribution of wealth, healthcare, education, all these type of things. Change in a government is necessary at times for these things to happen. But I'm talking in terms of Guyana's economy, son. Do you?
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, it's difficult to imagine a Guyana which is the Guyana we all want to live in, or Guyana we imagined it would be, if we don't have some significant changes. Whether or not you need a change in government for that to happen is a point for the politicians. What I do agree with you, Selwyn, is that we can't continue with a widening income and opportunity gap. And more than the income gap, it's the opportunity gap, where people who are born in certain circumstances in certain areas or whatever, really start off with a huge opportunity deficit. We can't have, that's no way to build a modern country. That's no way to best utilize the resources, the human resources we have. We have to ensure that we have a much more reliable and efficient provision of public goods and services, education, health, public safety. I would be terrified to have a daughter in Guyana today. The abuse by public officials, the abuse by people of power, of our women folk is appalling. The murders of women and children certainly cannot be tolerated in any decent and modern society. So there's lots of change that's required.
If that change commences now, how do you envision Guyana in 20 years?
I think it's going to take a little bit more than 20 years for any change which occurs now to really start to bear fruit because of the nature of where we're coming from. However, what I hope is that if generically change were to start happening, if we were to have an environment created where opportunity can become more egalitarian, where resources can be more easily accessed and exploited by those with talent, then I think in 20 years' time, we'll have a Guyana which has a net inflow of people. That's the first thing. Right now we're depopulating, and that's not a recipe for growth.
I'm glad you mentioned that. What are your thoughts on repatriation to contribute to Guyana's development?
It's extraordinarily difficult to turn to